There's a sound I never thought I'd hear again in my workshop. It came through concrete walls and a locked wooden door. Small, muffled, rhythmic. The kind of knocking a child makes when they're not sure anyone is listening, but they keep trying anyway, just in case. I was 72 years old, standing in my driveway on a Tuesday morning in October when my phone rang. It was Dale Hutchins, the electrician I'd referred to my daughter's property, a man I'd known for 20 years, a man who did not rattle easily. His voice was shaking. "Mr. Miller," he paused. I heard him clear his throat. "Mr. Miller, I'm over at the annex, behind the workshop. I think there's a kid in the basement. I can hear knocking, a little voice." I remember the sky was gray that morning, the kind of flat, cold Michigan gray that comes in off the lake and just sits there. I remember my coffee mug was still in my hand. I set it on the hood of my truck and said, "I'm on my way." I didn't ask questions. Something in me already knew that whatever was on the other side of that door was going to change everything. And I was right. But that was just the beginning of my plan.
My name is Harold Miller. I was born and raised in Mill Haven, Michigan, a small lakeside town where everybody's grandfather either fished for a living or built things for one. I chose to build. For 43 years, I ran a carpentry and custom woodworking shop out of a converted barn on the edge of my property. I built kitchen cabinets, staircases, porch frames, furniture that people handed down to their grandchildren. I wasn't famous, I wasn't wealthy, but I was proud and I was honest, and I always said the wood would tell you the truth about a job even when the man holding the saw wouldn't. My wife, Evelyn, passed 6 years ago, breast cancer. We had 38 years together, and I'll tell you plainly, not a day goes by that I don't reach for her in some small way. A habit of the heart, my doctor called it. I call it love that didn't get the message. After Evelyn, the workshop became my sanctuary. Every morning I'd walk out there, turn on the overhead light, run my hands along the edge of the work table she used to lean against while she brought me lunch, and I'd feel close to her. It was enough. For a while, it was enough. My daughter, Caroline, is my only child. She was a good girl. I want to be careful here, because the story I'm about to tell you is complicated in the way that family always is, layered, painful, and never entirely black and white. Caroline grew up watching me work. She knew the smell of sawdust and linseed oil before she knew her multiplication tables. When she was small, she used to sit on my workbench and hand me nails one at a time, very seriously, like she was assisting in surgery. But somewhere along the way, and I couldn't tell you exactly when, she started to see the workshop as something to leave behind. The town, the tools, the life that smelled like pine resin and honest labor. She went to college in Chicago, built a career in marketing, fell in love with a man named Brandon Caulfield. Brandon was polished, I'll give him that. Good-looking, smooth-talking, always had an answer and a handshake ready. He was in real estate development, the kind that puts up luxury townhomes and calls them community living. He wore clothes that cost more than my truck payment, and he looked at my workshop the way some people look at a museum exhibit. Interesting in a distant sort of way, but not relevant to their actual lives. I tried not to let it bother me. Caroline seemed happy, and that was what mattered. When they got married, I stood up at the reception and said, "All I've ever wanted for my daughter is a man who will build something good with her." I meant it. I genuinely meant it. The trouble came quietly, the way most betrayals do. A missed holiday here, an excuse there. A comment Brandon made once at dinner about how quaint our little town was. The way he said the word quaint, slow and precise, like he was placing it in quotation marks. Caroline started echoing him. "Dad, you should think about selling the workshop property. You're not using all of it. It's a real asset." Or, Dad, you don't need to hold on to everything just because it's old. If you've ever been made to feel like a relic in your own life, you know how that sits. Still, I wanted to believe in family. I wanted to believe that the distance between us was just geography and busyness, not something more permanent. So when Caroline and Brandon approached me about using the workshop annex, the small outbuilding with a finished basement that I'd built as a guest space years ago, I said yes. They were talking about renovating it, maybe using it as a rental property, and I signed over a use agreement that let them take it over for the season. I told them that building was built with your mother's hands as much as mine. Take care of it. Caroline hugged me. She said, "We will, Dad. I promise." That was 14 months before I got Dale Hutchins' phone call. I want you to remember that hug. I want you to hold it in your mind, because I had to hold it in mine on a very hard morning, and I needed it to mean something even when everything around it turned out to be a lie.
I drove the 3 blocks to the workshop annex faster than I should have for a man my age on a wet road. Dale was standing outside the side entrance when I pulled up. He's a stocky man, mid-50s, the kind of guy who's seen his share of strange things on job sites. He was pale. "I didn't open it," he said. "Figured I'd wait for you. But Mr. Miller, I've been standing here for 20 minutes and I can still hear it." I had a spare key on my ring, always kept one for emergencies, a habit from 40 years of running a working property. I found it. My hand was steadier than I expected. I unlocked the basement door and I pulled it open. The smell hit me first. Closed air, canned food, the faint sweetness of a child's unwashed hair. Then I heard it. A small voice said, "Hello?" I went down the stairs slowly, talking as I went. "Hey there, my name is Harold. I'm not going to hurt you. I'm just going to turn on the light, okay?" There was a pause. Then, "Okay." I found the pull chain and the overhead bulb came on. He was sitting on a fold-up camping cot in the corner. 8 years old, dark hair, wide brown eyes that had learned to be very careful about what they showed. He was wrapped in a blanket that had been washed so many times it was more gray than whatever color it started out. On the floor beside him, 3 cans of soup, a box of crackers, 2 picture books with cracked spines. "I'm Noah," he said. "Hi, Noah." My voice came out steady. I don't know how. "Mama said she'd come soon," he said. Then, quieter, "But Brandon said I'm not supposed to let anybody see me." There's a sentence I will carry for the rest of my life. I'm not supposed to let anybody see me. I knelt down beside that camping cot and I looked at that boy, and I understood something in one terrible clarifying moment that I had been refusing to understand for years. The family I thought I had was not the family that actually existed. If you've ever been betrayed by someone you love, this story is for you. Here is what I pieced together in the days that followed, with the help of a social worker named Diane and a family court attorney named Ruth Park, who became one of the most important people in my life. Noah was Caroline's son. She'd had him young, before Brandon, during a period of her life she'd never fully shared with me. There were difficult circumstances I won't detail here out of respect for the boy's story. She'd placed Noah with a distant cousin, a woman named Patricia, who raised him for the first several years of his life. Patricia died of a stroke in March of that year. Noah had come back. Brandon did not want Noah in the picture. I don't say this with exaggeration or bitterness. I say it as a plain fact, established later in a court record. Brandon had investors. Brandon had a brand. The words family values and community-centered living appeared on his marketing materials. He had a reputation carefully constructed around an image of success and stability. A child no one knew about, one with complicated origins and no convenient explanation, was, in Brandon's calculation, a liability. And Caroline, my Caroline, who used to hand me nails like she was assisting in surgery, had allowed herself to be persuaded.
She told herself it was temporary, that she'd figure it out, that she'd bring Noah into the open when the time was right. The time was never right, because Brandon kept making sure of that. And so a little boy spent weeks in a basement, alone, in a building that I had built with my own hands, in the town where I was born, on property I had handed over because I believed in family. I am not a man who cries easily. Evelyn used to tease me about it. "Harold, you'd sit dry-eyed through your own funeral," she'd say. I cried in that basement. I'm not ashamed of it. I took Noah's hand and I said, "You're coming with me now." He picked up his picture books without being asked. He'd learned to carry everything that mattered himself.
The first thing I did was take Noah to Dr. Patricia Ewan at the Millhaven Family Health Center. I called ahead from the truck and told her what I'd found. She was ready for us. Noah was malnourished, not critically, but enough. He had a vitamin D deficiency from weeks with almost no natural light. He had what the doctor described as significant anxiety presentation, meaning he flinched at loud voices, went rigid when a door slammed, and couldn't eat a full meal at a table without watching the exit. That night in my house, he woke up 3 times. Each time I heard him, I got up and sat in the chair beside the small guest bed, and I said nothing. Just let him know someone was there. By the 3rd time, he fell back asleep, holding the edge of my sleeve. I called a family court attorney the next morning. I also called the Michigan Department of Health and Human Services and filed a formal report. I want to be honest about something. Part of me wanted to get in my truck and drive to wherever Caroline and Brandon were, and I wanted to do it loudly. I'm a big man. I've got hands that have swung sledgehammers. There was something very old and very hot in my chest that morning, and it wanted an outlet. But here's what 43 years of carpentry teaches you. If you swing blind when you're angry, you damage the thing you're trying to fix. You measure twice, you cut once, and you make sure the joint holds. I measured. My attorney, Ruth Park, was 60 years old, about 5'2", and wore reading glasses on a beaded chain. She looked like someone's favorite librarian. She had a voice like a ballroom and a mind like a dovetail saw, precise, patient, and capable of cutting exactly where you needed without wandering. "Mr. Miller," she said, "tell me everything. Start with the property transfer." I told her everything. Here is what Ruth found, and what became the foundation of everything that followed. The annex building was mine, not theirs. I had signed a use agreement, a temporary occupancy arrangement, not a deed transfer. Brandon had apparently assumed that the informality of our family arrangement meant he had free rein. He assumed wrong. The building remained in my name, every room of it, including the basement where Noah had spent his weeks. That mattered legally in ways I'll explain, but what mattered to me personally, in a way I didn't expect, was this. The building was still mine. The thing I built had not been taken from me. It had been misused, abused, corrupted, but it was still mine to reclaim. If you've ever been betrayed by someone you love, this story is for you. I began to gather what Ruth called a documentation file. Hospital records from Noah's intake, Dale Hutchins' written statement, photographs of the basement, the cot, the cans, the 2 picture books, and Noah's drawings. In the first week he was with me, Noah drew almost constantly. I gave him a pad of paper and colored pencils, and he sat at my kitchen table for hours. The drawings were full of detail, rooms with no windows, doors with padlocks, a small figure sitting alone in corners, always smaller than the walls around it. Those drawings became evidence. A child's hand told a story that no adult could dispute. And then came what Ruth called the fulcrum. Brandon Caulfield had been for the past 18 months actively marketing a luxury residential development called Lakeshore Commons, 48 units, high-end finishes, community clubhouse, price points starting at $400,000. The marketing language was thick with words like family, legacy, roots, and community spirit. He had a profile piece pending in a regional business publication. He had investors at 3 separate meetings in the coming month. Ruth filed the documentation of the child endangerment investigation with the relevant municipal licensing board.
She also contacted the attorneys for 2 of the investment groups, not to make accusations, but simply to ensure they were aware of pending legal matters involving principals of the Lakeshore Commons project. That's all she did. She didn't shout, she didn't threaten. She used the quiet, factual language of legal process, and she aimed it with precision at the one thing Brandon Caulfield had worked hardest to protect: his image. Within 72 hours, 2 investors requested meetings. Within a week, 1 had pulled out entirely. A local reporter named Jessica Tran, who covered community affairs for the Millhaven Register, called my attorney's office. Ruth didn't give her much. She didn't need to. The public records were public. Jessica did her own work, and the story she ran was careful and factual. The headline read, "Developer behind Family Values Project faces child endangerment investigation." I didn't feel triumphant when I read it. I felt tired, the way you feel when you've been holding something very heavy for a long time and you finally set it down. Brandon and Caroline came to my house 2 days after the article ran. Brandon was in a suit. He looked different from the last time I'd seen him. Thinner in the face, with something strained around the eyes. Caroline stood slightly behind him. She couldn't look at me directly. "Harold," Brandon said, "this has gotten completely out of hand. This is a family matter. There's no reason this needs to involve courts and newspapers and—" "Noah is family," I said. "He's been family his whole life. You just didn't want to claim him." "That's not— You don't understand the complexity." "I understand that an 8-year-old boy was locked in a basement on property I own, and I understand that the man doing the locking was you. I don't think there's much complexity than that." Caroline said my name. Just my name. Dad. Like a question she didn't know how to finish. "I love you," I told her. "That's not in question. But love and responsibility are not the same thing. You had a child and you failed him. That's not something I can let pass because it's uncomfortable for anyone." They left. I went back inside and found Noah at the kitchen table, eating cereal and reading a library book about trains. He'd started sleeping through the night. I sat down across from him and watched him read, and I thought, this is what I was supposed to protect all along. The court proceedings took 5 months. I won't walk you through every hearing and filing because that would take longer than the story deserves. What I'll tell you is this. Family court, when a child has been harmed, moves with a kind of deliberate thoroughness that is both frustrating in its slowness and reassuring in its seriousness. The judge assigned to our case was a woman named Judge Annette Okafor. She had 22 years on the family bench. She asked Noah, gently, carefully, through a child advocate, what he remembered about the basement. Noah told her about the knocking, about hoping someone would hear. Judge Okafor wrote in her ruling that the circumstances constituted a profound and willful disregard for the welfare of a minor, and that the documentation presented established a pattern of deliberate concealment that went well beyond negligence. Brandon was charged with child endangerment and child neglect. He pled guilty to a lesser charge as part of an agreement, received a fine and probation, and was ordered to complete parenting classes, though parenting at that point was moot since he and Caroline had separated by then. Caroline was found to have been an enabling party. Her consequences were significant, though not criminal. The court was clear that she had known, had been present, and had chosen compliance over protection. She lost legal custody of Noah entirely. She called me the night after the ruling. She was crying, not the polished, managed kind of crying that people do in public, but the raw, hollow kind that means something has finally broken through. "Dad," she said, "I don't know how I let it happen." I sat with that for a long moment. "Neither do I, Caroline," I said, "but I think you have to sit with that question honestly before there's any road forward." "Do you hate me?" "No," I said, "but right now my first concern is Noah, and it has to stay that way for a while." She understood, or she began to. If you've ever been betrayed by someone you love, this story is for you. And if you've ever had to choose justice over comfort, even when it cost you something precious, then you know the weight of the moment I'm describing. I became Noah's temporary guardian the week after the ruling and his permanent legal guardian 6 months later. He started second grade at Millhaven Elementary. His teacher, Mrs. Brennan, told me at our first conference that he was quiet but observant, that he watched everything carefully before deciding it was safe, but that once he trusted you, he was fully present, fully there. He reminds me of a good student, she said, who just needed someone to tell him the classroom was safe. I've thought about that a lot, because isn't that all any of us need, really? Not a perfect world, just a safe room to be in. In the evenings, Noah started coming out to the workshop with me. I'd gotten it back, of course, all of it. The annex was resecured and the use agreement formally dissolved. I had the basement professionally cleaned and repainted. I was not sentimental about reclaiming it. I was practical. I had plans. But the workshop itself, the original barn, the one I'd been running for 40 decades, that space began to change in a way I hadn't fully anticipated. Noah would sit on the same workbench Caroline used to sit on when she was his age. He'd watch me run a planer or set a tenon, and he'd ask questions in that careful way he had, not rushing, just wanting to understand each step before the next one. "Why do you sand it if it already looks smooth?" he asked one evening. "Because looking smooth and being smooth aren't the same thing," I said. "The sanding gets you to the truth of it." He thought about that and nodded. We started making small things together. A birdhouse, a small shelf for his room, a step stool so he could reach the bathroom sink more easily without climbing on the toilet, which he'd been doing quietly for weeks before I noticed. The step stool took us 2 evenings. He measured the wood himself with a tape measure, lips moving slightly as he counted the inches. When we finished, he stood on it and looked at himself in the bathroom mirror, and he said, "I made this." "You made this," I confirmed. He smiled. It was the first time I'd seen his whole face in it.
About 4 months after the guardianship was finalized, I had an idea. I'd been thinking about what to do with the workshop long term. I was 73 by then, and the full production work was starting to wear on my back. I had regulars who I hated to leave without a craftsman they trusted, but I also knew the pace I'd kept for 40 years was not sustainable. What I wanted, what I found myself returning to evening after evening, was what happened when Noah and I worked together. That quality of attention, that kind of learning that happens when your hands are doing something real. I proposed what I started calling the Millhaven Makers Workshop to the town's Parks and Recreation Board. The idea was simple: open my workshop 2 evenings a week and 1 Saturday morning per month to community members, primarily seniors and kids. Small projects, birdhouses, picture frames, herb garden boxes, simple repairs. No experience necessary. Equipment and materials provided at minimal cost. The board approved it in 2 meetings. The local hardware store donated a supply fund. 3 retired tradespeople, a plumber, an electricist, and a former cabinet maker named Joe Briggs, who'd worked 2 towns over, volunteered as co-instructors. We opened in January. The first Saturday, 9 people came. By March, we had a wait list. There was a 10-year-old girl named Sophia who could not get enough of the scroll saw. There was a man named Walt, 78, who'd never worked with wood a day in his life, and cried a little when he finished his first shelf, because he said he'd always felt like a person who didn't make things. There was a grandmother named Dottie who made a birdhouse and painted it to match her late husband's fishing cabin and brought it in the next week just to show us. Noah came every session. He started quiet, as he did with everything new. But I watched him, over the course of those first weeks, begin to do something I hadn't expected. He started helping. He'd notice when a newcomer was confused about which direction to sand, and he'd walk over and demonstrate, not saying much, just showing. He'd hand tools without being asked. He knew where everything was kept. One evening, I overheard him telling Sophia, very seriously, "You have to go with the grain. If you go against it, it fights you." I don't know where he'd heard that. Possibly from me. Possibly he'd figured it out himself. I thought about what that meant, going with the grain.
working with the truth of the material rather than against it. That's what justice had been too, in its way, not forcing a dramatic confrontation, not a fight, just working with the truth, patiently and precisely, until what was hidden came to light. There's a moment I want to tell you about because I think it's the center of everything. It was a Tuesday evening in April. The workshop was quiet, just Noah and me finishing up after a session. I was sweeping, he was organizing the sandpaper by grit the way I'd shown him, lower numbers on the left, higher on the right. He said, without looking up, "Grandpa Harold?" He'd started calling me that around Christmas. I hadn't asked him to, he just did it one day, and I'd kept my face neutral and my voice steady and said, "Yeah, buddy?" And we'd moved on, both of us knowing something had been decided. "Grandpa Harold, can you fix something if it's been broken a long time?" I stopped sweeping. I looked at him. It depends on how it broke and how long it sat. Some things, the longer they sit, the harder it gets. Others, wood especially, sometimes they settle into a new shape and you work with that shape instead of trying to get back to what they were. He was quiet for a moment. "I think I'm more like the second kind," he said. I set the broom against the wall and I sat down on the workbench across from him. "I think so too," I said, "and I think that's okay." He nodded and went back to sorting the sandpaper. I stayed up late that night, long after he was asleep, sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee gone cold. I was thinking about Evelyn and how she used to say that the most honest thing a person can do is keep showing up. She was right, as she usually was. Keeping showing up. That's the whole of it.
It's been 18 months now since the morning I drove 3 blocks on a cold, gray Michigan morning to answer a phone call that changed everything. Brandon Caulfield's development project collapsed in full. 2 lawsuits from investors, a zoning dispute that dragged into the following year. Last I heard, he'd relocated to another state and was working for someone else's firm, a quieter position, less visible. The glossy image he'd spent years constructing had turned out to be exactly what I always suspected, a finished surface over unsound framing. It doesn't hold. It never does. Caroline lives in a small apartment in Traverse City now. She's been in therapy. She calls once a month, not to ask about coming back into Noah's life immediately. She understands that road is long and must be walked carefully, but just to check in, to stay present in whatever small way is permitted. I don't know what the future holds for the two of them. That's not my story to write. It's hers and Noah's. What I can tell you is that the last time she called, she said, "Dad, what you did, not for me, but for him, I want you to know I understand now what it cost you." I told her the truth. It didn't cost me as much as you'd think. It gave me more than it took. That surprised her. I understood why. But here is what I know, at 73 years old, with sawdust on my boots and a second grader's birdhouse hanging in the workshop window. When you spend your life building things, you learn to see the difference between a structure that looks solid and one that truly is. The difference is in the joints. It's in whether the foundation was honest when it was laid, whether the materials were chosen for durability or for appearance, whether the person doing the work cared about what it would hold. I lost a version of my family the morning I opened that basement door, but I found something in its place that I didn't know I was missing. A boy who needed someone to teach him the grain runs one direction and you learn to work with it, not against it. A workshop full of people learning to make something out of nothing. An old man who had started to feel like a relic, finding out that the most useful thing he'd ever built was still ahead of him. Last Saturday, Noah and I walked down to the lake shore after the morning session. I was carrying a small birdhouse he'd made himself, start to finish, with only minimal direction from me. Simple pine, basic joinery, but square and solid, a genuine piece of work for an 8-year-old. We found a young oak at the edge of the park, and I lifted him up so he could hang it on the low branch himself. He stepped back and looked at it. The morning light was coming off the lake at that low golden angle you only get in April in Michigan, the kind of light that makes everything look like it was made on purpose. "You think a bird will actually use it?" he asked. "Give it time," I said. "They always figure out where it's safe." He reached up and took my hand, and we walked back along the water. That's all. That's the whole story. Justice was served in a courtroom, yes, but the real thing, the thing that lasts, the thing worth building, happened in a workshop, one Saturday morning at a time, one small piece of wood at a time, one child learning slowly and surely that the world contains people who will show up. For the first time in a long time, I felt free. And if I'm honest, so did he. What would you have done?